So today, I read those first couple of verses of Judges 13, and actually the story goes through chapter 17, so I'm not going to be reading all that, but kind of telling you the story as we go. Several years ago, there was 16 big whales found dead near a beach, and apparently what happened is they swam into the shallows and was unable to return. And they think, one expert thinks, that they were following a school of menace, and they just got into the shallow water. They couldn't go back, and so they laid there and died. And that kind of shows you, it's kind of an illustration of what happens when we pursue trivial things in this life and not really concentrate on the things that we should. And so a Bible character that might sound familiar to you sort of epitomizes this. His name was Samson. We all kind of know the story of Samson. Sort of, anyway, we sort of know it, but he was the 13th and final judge in Israel. After that, they, of course, put King Saul on the throne, and there was no longer judges. But a judge in Israel was a fellow that was called by God. In one case, a lady that was called by God, and to do a specific thing. And when they say they judged Israel, it means they settled disputes between the tribes, and they were generally the ruler of Israel, even though it was more in a presidential way than it was in a king way. So, but he had everything going for him. He had a godly home. He had a sharp mind. He had a strong body. He had a sense of humor. They say he was very handsome. Apparently the ladies thought so. And Alexander White says, what more could God or man or angel of God have done for Samson that was not done? He just basically had it all. And you remember those people. You might have been one, I don't know. But you know, you're in school, you're growing up, and there's always one or two people who, they were most beautiful, they were the most popular, they were the best looking, and they seemed to do everything perfectly. That's the kind of guy that Samson was. But he wasted all that. He broke God's laws, and he went against his parents by falling in love with these pagan women. His acts of deliverance were brutal. He was brutal in his ways, and he was angry. He was angry a lot. If any of us think about it, anger can destroy you. You know, you can have that hot flash of anger, and it's like somebody else is in your body doing stuff that when you look at it later, you think, did I act like that? You know? But he spent time with these pagan prostitutes, and though he could beat 1,000 men, he was beaten by a woman. His enemies blinded him. They worked him at a meal like an animal. They made fun of him. And when he pushed aside those pillars and killed thousands, he killed himself too, you know. He was a tragic waste of a person is what it amounted to. But chapter 13 tells about his birth and his call. It was a time of servitude. There was a cycle that went through Israel like it does everywhere pretty much. They would sin, God would kind of stomp on them and then deliver them, and it went through all this cycle. There was Jephthah, a judge who sacrificed his own daughter because he made a stupid vow. And there's other stupid vows that were made in the Bible. One of my favorites is when Saul told his army nobody could eat until this battle was over, which was kind of stupid because the men needed their strength. His son Jonathan goes through a forest, finds a honeycomb, and sticks his staff in it and licks it. His eyes got bright. So when I eat honey, I tell Sarah, do my eyes look brighter? And but then Saul was just going to go put him to death because of it, and the army kind of rebelled on that. But after 30 years of peace and 3 minor judges, the Bible says the Israelites sinned against the Lord again, and he let the Philistine rule them for 40 years. Now these Philistines, the name means strangers. They arrived from sea, by sea, from somewhere else. We don't really know where they came from, but they settled on the coast of Israel probably during the time of Deborah, and established 5 cities there. They were technologically superior. Now to us, that don't seem to mean a lot, the difference between the Bronze Age and the Iron Age. But the Philistines were in the Iron Age. In other words, their weapons were iron. They had iron spears, iron arrowheads, iron swords. Everybody else had bronze stuff and copper or even stone. You know, it was their technological advancement made them superior in war to everybody else. And so they ruled Canaan's farmers, they ruled Israel sometimes just because they had better weapons. In fact, it tells us there in one place that the Philistines actually set up sharpening shops that they would charge the farmers for sharpening their implements, and that way they would control them, you know, kind of like they control us today. But the period of the Judges was a moral and ethical sewer. Hester calls it the dark ages of Hebrew history. God had warned Israel of the idolatry, the wickedness of the people, and why God wanted them exterminated. God wanted all those Canaanites exterminated, and the Israelites failed at that. Archaeologists have found the bones of babies near Canaanite altars. So we know from the Bible and also from archaeology that these people practiced child sacrifice. And if you can imagine anything worse than that. And the tragedy, the great tragedy is, we shake our heads and think how awful that is, but it's going on today. It's going on today in medical clinics. What's the difference, really?
No difference.
The Bible says over and over that there was no king in Israel, and every man, including the Israelites, did what was right in his own eyes. So can you imagine a world where we had that degree of order? Even today, we have more order than that. You know, we don't do what's right in our own eyes, but it's coming to that. Homosexuals beat upon the door to have sex with a guest, and the owner gave him his virgin daughter and the guest's concubine. They all raped the concubine and left her dying at the door. And the guest cut her into pieces and sent her to all the tribes to show that there'd been this horrible thing went on. Samson killed 30 innocent men for their clothes because of a bet. He burns animals alive to destroy fields. The Philistines kill his wife and father-in-law by burning them alive. And after the tribe of Dan slaughtered a peaceful village, it set up an idol and hired a priest to minister it. Guess who the priest was? He was a descendant of Moses, probably his grandson. The book of Judges begins with men having their thumbs cut off and ends with the grandson of Moses bowing to an idol. So it was a time of sin. It was a bad time. It was also a time of salvation. After 40 years of Philistine rule, the angel appeared to a woman named Zora who lived with her husband Manoah near the Philistine area. She had no children, but he promised her she'd have a baby, kind of like he did with Sarah and Mary. And he told her this son would save Israel. And her husband said, come back and tell us what we must do with the boy when he is born. He said that to the angel. And Samson, by the way, his name means sunshine. He was the sunshine of a boy. He was dedicated to God as perpetual Nazarite. Now, we don't know what Nazarites exactly meant, but we do know they were devoted to God from birth. They could never drink wine. They couldn't cut their hair. They couldn't touch a dead body. And they were set aside to God. We don't know all of that is, but they were set aside to God. And he was the kind of young man that all the girls looked up to, all the boys did too. The girls idolized him. You know the type of guy I'm talking about. He was the life of the party. He loved riddles, so he must have had a good sense of humor. He was strong and athletic, but you know, despite all that, he was a failure, and that happens too. Compared to the other judges, he had everything. You know, Gideon was just a poor, we talked about him last week, he was just a poor farmer who didn't have anything. Here's Samson was privileged, he had everything. And even in, with all this that the Spirit gave him, he never really delivered his people. Ehud's life brought 80 years of rest, and Deborah and Gideon both produced 40 years of rest. But there wasn't much rest during the time of Samson. He was blessed like Moses, but not like Moses in other ways. Look at how undisciplined he was. First, he defied his parents and God by going down to the Philistine land and wanting to marry one of their women. These people were natural enemies, but he wanted to marry one of their women. He wasn't doing it to make friends with them. That's just what he wanted to do. He broke the law of God against intermarriage from Deuteronomy 7:3. Broke his parents' heart. It's awful. It's a blessing when our children marry someone, but it's a disaster when it's the wrong one. It is. Samson didn't care about God and his parents. He said, "She pleases me" in 14:7. So basically, if it feels good, do it. That's what they're doing today. That's what goes on out there in the world. If it feels good, do it. I ain't hurting nobody. I'm gonna do it. Samson defiled his body, touching the carcass of a lion. Remember, he wasn't supposed to touch any dead bodies that he killed, and he later visited a prostitute in 16:1 and 2. We never read anything about him being on alcohol or drugs or any of that, but sexual passions was his problem. Satan said, "This is a crack that's in his armor, that's his tender spot, and we'll go after him." And that's what he does with all of us. He knows where our tender spot is. We all have one. It's too bad, but you know what your weaknesses are. You know it, and most people can see it. Resist the devil and he will run for you, James 3:7. But James also said, submit yourself therefore to God. So we have to, if we get rid of sin, we have to replace it by the love of Christ, by the lordship of him. We have to be committed. And I think everybody has a secret area of uncommitment, and that's probably the same area where you sin. So when Samson and the Philistine girl were to be married, the Philistine men had a party, and he gave them a riddle and bet all 30 of them a suit of clothes they couldn't solve it. So they threatened his wife with death if she didn't get the answer from Samson. She nagged him until he told her, and the men gave the right answer. Now he was a sore loser. So he knew he had to pay these 30 suits of clothes, so he goes out and kills 30 men, gets their clothes and gives them to them to satisfy this debt. That's sort of not a good way to do, is it? Went home mad. When he cooled down and came back, he found his bride had been given to his best man. So he caught 300 foxes, tied their tails together by twos, and put a torch on them and turned them loose in the Philistine fields and destroyed their crops. And I'm sure the foxes died too. I like foxes. We've got some in our yard. That's just cruel. But the Philistines retaliated. They burned his bride and her whole family. And but God, God uses things to accomplish his purpose, even bad things. But if he uses one where we sin to accomplish his purpose, that doesn't leave us off, though. It didn't get us out of it. We still got to pay for it. So anger in Samson lashes out. He kills 30 innocent men. And we do the same thing sometimes, you know. When you get angry and you lash out, you hurt people, and that lasts. You know, we don't get over it quickly. People remember stuff like that too, and you know, it makes me sad to think about a few times that I got angry and lost control of myself when I shouldn't have. Samson failed because he couldn't control his desires. He couldn't control his temper. A lot of people are like that today. Just turn the internet on. So God used Samson's temper to make him Israel's judge. After the fire in their fields, the Philistine army came into Israel to capture him. So the posse arrives, and he grabs up a jawbone of a donkey as a weapon and kills 1,000 people. And people today will say, oh, that's impossible, but it says he did it. And after that, he judged Israel for 20 years. Now, we don't know, that might have been a relatively peaceful time in there. I think the Philistines were afraid of him. So he did some good stuff. But 3,000 Judeans, instead of trusting God, were ready to hand Samson over to their army, to an army 1/3 their size. B.H. Carroll wrote, the national cowardice of both Israel and Philistia forms the dark outline of his sublime and solitary courage. He seems to have been the only brave, absolutely fearless man in two nations, and stalks among them like a titan among quail. So he never led Israel into sin like Gideon. He never offered human burnt offerings like Jephthah. He never went into idolatry, but he wasn't much, but he was the best God had to do the job, and God used what he needed to do, you know. And if we wait until we're good enough to do the job calls us to do, if we wait until we're worthy enough to witness or teach or preach, then it's never going to get done. It's never going to get done. If you're called to give, to help somebody, and you don't do it, then maybe nobody else will do it. Maybe it don't get done. Samson's weakness was women, and no wife is mentioned except a prostitute. This woman, we all know her name, Delilah. She found out the secret to his power, and while he was asleep on her lap, a man cut his hair, and he lost that strength. We don't know why God did it that way, but the Philistines seized him and bound him into chains and put his eyes out and put him to work in the prison, pushing a mill around like a donkey would have done to grind grain. Old-time preachers said, sin binds, and sin grinds. And that's kind of the way what happened to Samson. So it's a perfect example of what sin does to its victims. There was a story of an old preacher had a coffin placed in front of his pulpit. Now, I've never been to a funeral where anybody actually said this, but he preached on the tragic results of sin experienced by the person in the coffin. And I've never heard that, but I'm sure in the old days they probably did that. But when the sermon was finished, the people said, he told the people to come by and look in the coffin. As each one did, they stepped back in horror. They looked in, and it was like looking at themselves. They saw themselves. So no matter who you are or who you think you are, the wages of sin are death. That's what Paul said. There's still death today. Dr. Charles Allen says there are three things God will never do. He'll never let us off. When we sin, we pay for it. He'll never let us down. When we draw near to him, he will draw near to us. He will never let us go. We may leave God, but God will never leave us. And Samson, you know, we see all three of this with Samson. God didn't let him off. He had to pay for what he did. When they called him into the temple to celebrate and show him off, and they chained him to the pillars, and there was 5 kings in the building. There was 3,000 people on the roof because there was not enough room for them in the building. And he felt his strength coming back. He stood there on those pillars, and he prayed for the old time power just one more time. And they laughed at him, and Samson prayed. God answered his prayer, and Samson killed more people at his death than during his life. That was verses 16:10. he pushed those pillars apart, and that building came down and killed all these people. So Samson left the Lord, but the Lord never left Samson, and I don't think he ever leaves us. His hair began to grow in prison. He started feeling this strength coming back, and he probably saw many things during the time he was out there in the darkness, pushing on this lever to grind grain, and probably was being beaten to make him do it. He probably examined all these things and seen all the stuff that his anger had brought him. But he saw his broken-hearted parents. He saw Delilah. He saw those Philistines that he killed. He saw those people that he killed with no reason. So we can all get out there. And, I guess that's the main message of this whole thing. We can all get out there and do stupid, foolish, idiotic things. None of us are exempt from it. And all of us have probably done it at one time or another. As he walked around and ground that grain, maybe tears came to his eyes, and maybe he said, God, give me one more chance, and so God did. And, sin draws you in. There's a story about John Hunter tells. He seen a dozen hogs in a pen outside a slaughterhouse, and he wondered, how do they get those pigs in the slaughterhouse? Well, soon a man came out with a big bucket of hog food, and he threw a handful in, and the pigs squealed with delight and ran to it. Then he poured some on the ground outside the fence, and they run out there. Then he poured some in the doorway, and they run in. Pretty soon, they just followed him right on into the slaughterhouse and lost their lives. He led them to the door of their death. Satan dropped a fruit, and Eve ran to it. And Satan dropped a bottle, and Noah ran to it. And he dropped a beautiful woman with David and Samson. And he dropped 30 pieces of silver, and Judas ran to it. So we need to think about that. We need to make sure we're not chasing menace like those whales did, and we're chasing the Lord instead. And that's a big thing in our life, because we're not exempt from anything anybody else is. Let's pray.